Howdy folks, and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today I'm focusing on this Amazon Prime show. I'm a Virgo, but even if you didn't watch it, even if you're more at my show to think how humanity is going to reconfigure or how we should reconfigure as our climate systems are unraveling, stick around because I got a lot of insights I think for you. A great place to start analyzing any media is just I heard on a BBC documentary that Karl Marx put forward, and I bring up Karl Marx because this show addresses communism. Karl Marx put forward that all cultural institutions, in those days it wasn't really a media like today exactly, but there was press and books and plays and music, that they all worked together to support the status quo, sort of paraphrasing him here, or paraphrasing that BBC documentary. So thought about in that light, there's some really amazing breakthroughs in this TV series, but there's also some ways that I think we could argue it sort of fits the dominant paradigm too. And I'm really only going to talk about three characters: the hero.
I mean, you're doing your whole superhero thing. I know that's very exciting for you.
Exciting? You think that this is exciting? It's necessary, Mother.
Jones and Cootie. The hero is this like a action character. He's apparently a white billionaire, kind of reminiscent of Batman in a sense, who goes around the Bay Area, this fictitious version of the Bay Area, just crushing crime with his high-tech, super-tech toys. The media portrays the hero as a hero, but as this documentary carries on, as the series carries on, it shows you some of the crime he's crushing are like rent strikes or people protesting for better health care. But what I thought was really cool about what the author did here is to really sort of question this action hero paradigm. You know, for me, once I started questioning the dominant paradigm, I started questioning if all these wars the US of A gets into are really in our best interest. When I would argue with my fellow countrymen, hey, we shouldn't be invading this country or cooing that country. And all the pushback I would get, just this simple-minded, in a sense, for lack of a better way of putting it, belief that just we, in quotes, are the good guys and there's no hidden agendas in this war, no hidden agendas in this coup. I felt in a way this is almost coming from sort of an indoctrination from all these action heroes. So it was really refreshing to see the action hero paradigm brought into question. Cootie's the lead character in a sense, and he's this young African-American guy who's the coming of age, as they say it, but the twist with him is he's a giant, and that sort of sets up the superhero conflict. By happenstance, this young giant befriends this lady named Jones and just two of her friends. Jones is a community activist. She declares herself a communist. But just pause for a moment at Jones declaring herself a communist and this being portrayed in the light of something positive, or how it looks to somebody who considers themselves a communist.
Look, I'm a communist. I want the people to democratically control the wealth we create with our labor.
Over most of my lifetime, except maybe my early childhood, I saw films that maybe portrayed how communism looked to people who consider themselves communists, how they had this hopefulness about workers uniting and throwing off their shackles. For the most part, our media portrayal, our teachers, our education system, just really all shows negative, 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 almost making it equated with the word evil.
I gotta hand it to you, commies. You're committed.
So in that regard, this was a real breakthrough in the media, especially considering the nature of media ownership that Karl Marx critiqued then, and we could still critique it the same way now. It's all largely owned by very wealthy individuals or large business interests. The very wealthy individuals who and large business interests that would naturally feel threatened by people calling to redistribute the wealth or return to how it was in the Soviet days of a largely public sector owned economy. Notably in my critique, Jones's two of her main activisms are revolving around rent strikes because the rent's getting too high for people, and around the affordability of healthcare, which is another modern day actual issue in our world. Jones lays out a really eloquent critique of capitalism, something she describes as the crisis of capitalism.
There is a phenomenon called the crisis of capitalism. Under capitalism, businesses combine labor and materials to create goods or services for sale. Each year, they must make more money than the last to compete or else be crushed by competitors. They do this by lowering wages and raising prices,
making their product unaffordable for the people who are producing them. But here is where I want to point out a problem Number one, and how this show sort of fits in with the dominant paradigm rather than upending it. Well, in the past, in the US of A, it was solved by a vigorous union movement, as well as, I believe, competition from the Soviet Union. Because of that competition from a public sector system, capitalism in America and in many places in the world had to prove itself and therefore make things more fair and affordable. So what's lacking here, and what's really much harder to solve within capitalism, the bigger crisis, is the ecological crisis, the way it's steering our work and our lives into, in a sense, really basically getting compensated to pump our biosphere full of carcinogens and greenhouse gases, to poison ourselves and superheat the planet. And let's take the current modern day example of Starbucks as the unionization movement is gaining strength again. Well, part of the Starbucks business model is the drive-through and the disposable cup. You're servicing an economy of stressed out people who are in a hurry to get to their jobs. And let's say their job is to manufacture disposable cups. So they go through Starbucks so they can get to that factory on time to make those cups. And all of it is just creating a lot of extra pollution for really a go nowhere rat race. So even if you get these better conditions for the workers, which I fully support, and those expensive lattes are affordable for the people working there, well, you're still a part of that whole, you're pumping the earth full of carcinogens, toxics, and greenhouse gases to facilitate a go nowhere rat race. And as those workers get a fair shake out of it, get a bigger stake with, and start to feel and identify as middle class, they now have even more of an interest of defending the system that is poisoning them, poisoning all of us. And when it comes to the destruction of our biosphere or the poisoning of it, as well as the climate crisis, really, the wealthy are going to have an easier time coping with it in the interim, or those who are simply upper middle class, but their McMansions, as they used to call them, are still vulnerable as the tornadoes go rampaging through where they didn't used to because the houses are so cheaply built. While they might not live at the front lines of an industrial chemical plant, they're still exposed to all these carcinogens that are unnecessarily filling our biosphere and coming down with cancer unknowingly. This crisis of capitalism affects people who think they are beneficiaries of it as well as those who are not. In fact, I doubt we would even have a climate crisis today if the Soviet Union had not collapsed. Why? Because could you imagine the propaganda, as people called it, that would have resulted from, hey, look, they are so greedy, they're just going to keep burning fossil fuels even if it's heating the planet. This system is crazy. I don't think it would have. I think there would have been international treaties by now, and the whole thing would have been scaled back. And we wouldn't be standing here at the precipice of climate crisis. Now, Jones also portrays capitalism as sustained by violence.
All business, legal and illegal, uses violence to regulate itself.
She mostly here focuses on property ownership, highlighting the deed.
I have a deed showing my ownership.
Right. So you show the deed.
Fine.
The only reason that piece of paper is worth anything is because it implies that men with guns are going to come to physically enforce the words written on it.
And then she draws this analogy about how when marijuana was illegal, people had to enforce their contracts through illegal street violence.
Illegal business doesn't have this. Illegal business practitioners can't go to court and say, Your Honor, I was supposed to be buying a whole key of cocaine from the defendant. Clearly, this is half baking soda. I demand restitution.
But I still find it a little lacking and compelling to those who are not already converted, as they used to say, because most of us really do fear street crime and street violence and do feel safer having police around. I feel a stronger critique, but maybe it wouldn't have worked fairly with his movie or his TV series, is to focus on the killing of environmental activists, especially within Latin America, where they're standing in the way of these projects, be it oil and gas or deforestation. And my concern where there's a bit of undermining, a self-undermining of the left, is that within the focus on landlords that's been popular off and on throughout history, the problem here is that, owning rental properties is really largely a mom and pop operation. Yes, there are some big players in the business, but a lot of it's just a mom and pop. It's somebody who used to own a house, they moved, now they rent it out. Or it was historically, up until prices went through the roof, maybe the purview of someone who's like, you know what, I don't want to keep working till I die. I'm going to buy a rental property, try to rent it out. And then all of a sudden that person finds themselves the bad guy. And by vilifying them, you're really driving a lot of people unnecessarily into the arms of what people call the right wing, which is then voting against their own interests when it comes to climate and the environment. But also go back to Jones's focus also on healthcare. Now, that's an issue that really would benefit both the small business owners, like those small landlords, as well as those who are completely disenfranchised from the capitalist system. Well, how so? If you freed up small business owners from having to pay for this exorbitant healthcare cost, they could really focus on growing their businesses much more easily. The same for pensions too, really, and many other aspects. There's a lot of win-wins with socialist policies. So I really urge people to focus on solutions that are going to bring in small business owners rather than isolate them. Now, here more controversially, I just want to point out that the show also fulfills some stereotypes about the left regarding the culture wars. And I think arguably there's also some self-limiting and self-reinforcing or even self-destructive potential within that. Let me explain. So one thing is the Jones and her friends introduced Cootie to marijuana.
Well, I was reading that love in a relationship is built through knowing someone.
Bro, pass that shit.
I realize a lot of my viewers probably like marijuana, and I'm not really exactly drawing a point here one way or the other, but I did hear a friend I knew back when I was much younger who considered himself a communist, and I was arguing for a more libertine attitude towards drug use, and he was arguing against it, saying, have you ever noticed, Kai, that drug use seems to be promoted among those who are most likely to question capitalism? Another Jones and her friends introduced Cootie to this thing called a sideshow, where they do this like spinning of cars. And it's a reckless, dangerous activity where people, I believe, have actually died from that. And then lastly, Jones herself was shown as being in a same-sex relationship. Now, here people would generally consider that to be inclusion or representation, but within the like Ron DeSantis community, and I've also heard on Catholic radio, there's a feeling that every media seems to need to include, every story, every narrative seems to have to include some type of an LGBTQ theme. And I don't know to what line, if it's really clear, media is representing reality and including as opposed to creating reality. To what degree are we who we are just based on our genes? That's who we are. And to what degree are we influenced by what we see or subtle social cues? That story is not really open and closed. Now, wherever you come down on those culture war issues really is not exactly the point here. The point here is that if somebody comes down to a more conservative side of, let's say, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, they still may have a built-in interest in questioning how capitalism is running roughshod as is currently configured over our environment, as well as leaving many people feeling excluded and marginalized and shut out, stressed, and insecure. So, and you really need to understand to the conservative mindset how the left looks if they're not understanding the way I am that the real crisis here of capitalism is the burning down of our planet. Well, it looks to them like this is all about the forces of chaos versus the forces of order. And it's really important to cut past and through that narrative. Well, how did Marx get so associated with, or Marxism get so associated with cultural liberalism? Well, one of the things I also heard in that BBC documentary is Karl Marx wrote for a pro-capitalist or a pro-bourgeois newspaper before he joined the Communist Party, because at that point he saw capitalism as progress against these stodgy old aristocrats and the church and these type of institutions he viewed as holding down the people. But then he came to see these massive factories and this industrialization and these amazing production, but how people were being made into almost wage slaves, living these miserable lives. So then he began to feel, well, there's something even beyond capitalism, and that would be called socialism. But he retained his initial distaste, if you will, for the old ways. And the problem is in times of crisis, people will rally back to the old ways. And this is one of the reasons why the left has lost time and time again, when really it should be much more of a unifying force for people. Well, I hope you found this really interesting, some food for thought, a pretty cool critique. If so, please make sure you're subscribed, you're commenting, you're liking, constructive criticism. Hey, I'm cool with that. And hey, as always, until next time, I thank you for donating a Patreon and my two patrons, Bella Gristy, Environmental Coffee House. And as always, until next time, peace be with you, amigo.